The sun was a hammer, and the town of redemption was the anvil. It beat down upon the single dusty street with a ferocity that seemed personal, intent on scorching the very hope out of the air. Elara stood on the warped planks of the train platform, a solitary figure in a dark wool dress utterly unsuited for this furnace of a world. The fabric was a cage of heat, a constant reminder that she was a foreign body here, a creature of damp cobblestones and shadowed alleys thrust into a land of blinding light and baked earth. Every breath she took was a mouthful of grit, a taste of the desolation that stretched in every direction, a featureless brown sea lapping at the shores of this sorry collection of unpainted buildings. She felt the stares of the few people who braved the midday glare. They were slow, appraising glances that stripped her down to her desperation, reading the story of her journey in the smudge of coal dust on her cheek and the tight grip she kept on her single, battered valise. She had been told a man would be here to meet her, a Mr. Blackwood. The name had sounded sturdy, reliable, like old oak, when she had first heard it whispered in a grimy solicitor's office thousands of miles away. It had been the anchor to which she had tethered the ragged remnants of her hope. But the train had hissed and sighed its departure an hour ago, leaving behind a silence that was louder and more menacing than the clatter of its wheels. The sun had climbed higher, bleaching the color from the sky, and still, there was no Mr. Blackwood. The hope was fraying, its strands snapping one by one with each passing minute, each bead of sweat that traced a path through the dust on her skin. Her anxiety was a living thing, a frantic bird beating its wings against the cage of her ribs. She was a parcel delivered to the wrong address, left on a doorstep to be claimed by no one. The world seemed to move in a haze of heat, the air shimmering above the baked dirt of the street. Men drifted in and out of the saloon, their faces grim and sun-cracked, their movements slow and deliberate as if conserving every drop of moisture. A blacksmith's hammer rang out with a mournful, rhythmic clang, the only sound that seemed to have any energy in this lethargic place. Elara watched it all from her lonely perch, feeling her own presence shrink under the vast, indifferent sky. She was a ghost at a feast she was not invited to, a whisper in a language no one here spoke. The promises that had brought her to this place had turned to ash in her mouth, tasting of deceit and the bitter tang of her own foolishness for ever believing them. The unfulfilled expectation was a hollow ache in her chest, a void where the sturdy oak of Mr. Blackwood was supposed to have been. Then, a new shape appeared at the far end of the street, resolving itself out of the shimmering heat. It was a man on a horse, leading another, a rangy pack mule burdened with sacks of flour and salt. He did not ride like the other men she had seen. There was no swagger, no show. He moved with the land, a part of it, his body and the horses moving in a single, fluid motion of profound competence. As he drew closer, she saw the details that the distance had blurred. He was not an old man, but the land had aged him, carving deep lines around his eyes and at the corners of his mouth. His hat was sweat-stained and pulled low, shadowing a face that was all angles and planes, as if carved from the unforgiving rock of the surrounding hills. He stopped not in front of the saloon or the general store, but before the train platform, his gaze sweeping over her once, a quick, assessing inventory that missed nothing. He was not Mr. Blackwood. He was something else entirely, something wilder and more real than the name she had been clinging to. He swung down from the horse in a single economical movement, the leather of his chaps creaking softly. He was tall, broader in the shoulder than she had first thought, and he moved with a quiet purpose that made the air around him seem to stand still. He did not speak. Instead, he pulled a folded, grimy piece of paper from his shirt pocket and held it out. Her name was written on it in a looping, elegant script that was jarringly out of place in his calloused hand. Elara felt a fresh wave of fear, cold and sharp despite the oppressive heat. This was it, the transaction. She was the merchandise and this was the collection. She gave a small, jerky nod, her throat too tight to form words. He looked from the paper to her face, his eyes a startlingly pale gray, the color of a winter sky. They held no warmth, no welcome, only a deep, bottomless weariness. "The buckboard has a split axle," he said. His voice was a low rasp, like stones grinding together, a sound that had been used so seldom it had forgotten how to be smooth. He gestured with his chin back the way he had come. "It is a half-day's walk." The words were not an apology or an explanation. They were a statement of fact, a problem laid bare between them. The confrontation was a chasm of silence and misunderstanding. He was a man of the wilderness, and she was a creature of the city. They were two different species meeting on hostile ground. She looked at his horse, a big, powerful roan that watched her with intelligent, wary eyes. She looked at the dusty street stretching into an endless, hostile horizon. The choice was clear, but it was not easy. To walk was to admit defeat, to succumb to the harshness of this place before she had even taken a step into it. To ride was to place her trust, her very life, in the hands of this grim, silent stranger. This was the first test, and she knew it. He was watching her, his expression unreadable, waiting to see what she was made of. Would she weep? Would she rail against the injustice of her situation? Would she crumble, another fragile thing broken by this land? Elara straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it was a bedrock of stubborn pride, a refusal to be seen as weak. She had survived far worse than a broken wheel and a silent man. She had survived the loss of everything she had ever known, the hunger that gnawed, and the cold that seeped into the bones. "I can ride," she said, her voice clearer and stronger than she had expected. A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, or a sliver of reluctant respect, passed through his pale eyes before it was gone. He gave a curt nod, a gesture of acceptance. The test was over. She had passed. He untied her small valise from where she had set it down and secured it behind his saddle with practiced efficiency. He did not offer her a hand. He simply turned to his horse, murmuring something low and calming to the animal, and swung himself up into the saddle. He then looked down at her, waiting. There was no concession to her femininity, no polite artifice. This was the reality of her new life. She would keep up, or she would be left behind. Taking a deep breath, Elara gathered her heavy skirts, placed a foot into the stirrup he had indicated, and hauled herself up behind him. It was an awkward, graceless motion, and she landed hard against his back. He was as unyielding as a stone wall. She wrapped her arms tentatively around his waist, her hands barely daring to touch the rough fabric of his shirt. Felt like embracing a mountain. Without another word, he nudged the horse with his heels, and they moved forward, leaving the dusty street and its judging eyes behind. The departure from redemption was not an escape into something better, but a deeper descent into the vast, intimidating wilderness. The last of the ramshackle buildings fell away, and the world opened up into an immense panorama of rock, sand, and scrub. The rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer faded, replaced by the creak of leather, the soft plod of the horse's hooves in the deep dust, and the whisper of a hot wind that sounded like the sigh of a lonely god. Elara felt as if they had ridden off the edge of the known world. The silence between them was a tangible thing, a heavy blanket that smothered any possibility of conversation. She was acutely aware of the man in front of her, the solid wall of his back, the faint scent of sun, sweat, and something else, gun oil perhaps. It was a smell of grim competence, of a life lived on the knife's edge of survival. The landscape was a character in this silent play, a monstrous, beautiful antagonist. Jagged mesas clawed at the impossibly blue sky, their sides streaked with millennia of rust and ochre. The sun beat down, reflecting off the pale earth with a blinding intensity that made her eyes water. The world was a symphony of browns and reds, a palette of dried blood and old bones. There was no softness here, no gentle green to soothe the eye. Every plant was a fortress of thorns and spines, locked in a desperate, silent war for water. The sheer scale of it was terrifying. It made her feel small, an insignificant speck of dust on a canvas of brutal grandeur. It was a land that did not care if you lived or died, a place that would bake your bones and scatter them with the same indifferent wind that sculpted the monolithic rocks. It mirrored the desolation in her own heart, the vast, empty space where her old life had been. For hours they rode. The sun crawled across the sky, a malevolent eye charting their slow progress. Elara's initial fear began to curdle into a strange kind of analytical observation. She watched the man, Caleb, as she had decided to call him in her mind, for he seemed as solid and unyielding as the biblical figure. She noted the way his eyes constantly swept the horizon, missing nothing. She saw the subtle shifts in his body that communicated with the horse, a language of pressure and weight that needed no words. He was vigilant, a part of this harsh world, not just a visitor passing through. He knew its rhythms, its dangers, its secrets, and in turn she felt his awareness of her. He must have felt the tremor of her exhaustion, the way her body slumped against his with each passing mile. But she did not complain. She bit her lip against the pain in her thighs and back, straightened her spine, and endured. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. This silent observation became a strange, unspoken dialogue. He was judging her endurance, her grit. She was judging his competence, his capacity for violence and for care. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in lurid shades of orange and purple, he finally reined the horse to a stop in the shadow of a towering rock formation. The air here was marginally cooler, a small reprieve from the relentless furnace of the open plain. He swung down from the saddle with the same fluid grace he had shown in town, his movements betraying no sign of fatigue. Elara, however, felt as if her bones had turned to jelly. She slid from the horse's back, her legs buckling beneath her. She would have fallen had she not caught herself on the stirrup leather, her knuckles white with the effort of staying upright. Caleb watched her for a moment, his face impassive. Then, he unhooked a canteen from his saddle and held it out to her. It was a simple gesture, but in the profound silence and hardship of the journey, it felt like a monumental act of grace. "Drink," he said, the single word rough from disuse. She took the canteen, her hands trembling slightly. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. She drank deeply, letting the water soothe the raw, dusty lining of her throat. When she was finished, she handed it back to him. Their fingers brushed for a fleeting second, his skin calloused and dry against hers. A jolt, small but distinct, passed between them. It was the first physical contact that was not born of necessity, a tiny spark in the vast, cold emptiness of their journey. He took a short drink himself before screwing the cap back on. He did not apologize for the hardship or offer words of comfort, but the small gesture of provision was enough. It was a crack in the wall of his stoicism, a hint of a decent man buried beneath the layers of grit and silence. The tension between them eased, just a fraction, as they stood together in the gathering twilight. They arrived at his homestead as the last light bled from the sky, leaving the world in shades of deep indigo and charcoal. The reveal was not a relief but a confirmation of her deepest fears. The dwelling was a small, crudely built cabin hunkered down in a shallow valley, looking as if it had grown from the earth itself. A larger barn stood nearby, its silhouette dark against the star-dusted sky. There were no other lights, no other signs of life for what felt like 100 miles in every direction. The isolation was absolute, a crushing weight that made her heart sink into her stomach. This was not a home. It was a fortress, a final outpost at the end of the world. The silence here was different from the silence of the journey. It was deeper, older, filled with the whisper of the wind and the distant cry of a coyote. It was the sound of utter, profound loneliness. Caleb dismounted and led the horse toward the barn. Elara slid to the ground, her body a single, unified ache. She expected him to lead her to the main cabin, to the life of servitude that the now meaningless contract had promised. Instead, he walked past it, toward a smaller structure she hadn't noticed at first, tucked away under the shadow of a lone, twisted cottonwood tree. It was a tiny lime cabin, barely more than a shed, but it was separate. He pushed open the door, which creaked in protest, and struck a match. The small flame illuminated a Spartan interior, a narrow cot, a small table with a single chair, and a stone fireplace, swept clean. He lit a lantern on the table, its golden glow pushing back the oppressive darkness. Then he turned to her and pointed to the inside of the door. There was a heavy wooden bolt, thick and sturdy. He slid it back and forth once, the sound loud in the quiet space. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to her fears, that she could only stare. He was giving her a lock on the inside. He was not her captor. He was her neighbor. He was demonstrating, in the only language he seemed to possess, the language of action, that he was not a threat. He was offering her autonomy, a sanctuary within his own sanctuary. It was a gesture of profound, almost shocking honor. In a world where she had been treated as a piece of property to be bought and sold, this simple piece of wood and iron was a declaration of her personhood. It was a wall he was building not to keep her in, but to keep himself out. The relief that washed over her was so immense it left her weak, and for the first time since arriving in this godforsaken land, she felt the sting of tears behind her eyes. He seemed to sense her turmoil, for he did not linger. He turned to leave, pausing in the doorway. "There is wood in the box," he said, gesturing to a crate by the hearth. "Water in the bucket. Food on the table." He had prepared for her arrival. A fire was not lit, but it was laid, ready for a match. The bucket of water was full. A cloth-wrapped parcel on the table contained a loaf of dark bread, a wedge of cheese, and a handful of dried apples. It was provision without presence, care without intrusion. He had anticipated her needs and met them before she even had to ask, all while maintaining the respectful distance symbolized by the bolt on the door. It was more kindness than she had been shown in years. He gave a final, curt nod and then was gone, melting back into the darkness, leaving her alone in the small bubble of lantern light, the silence of the valley rushing in to fill the space he had left behind. Days bled into weeks, each one a copy of the last, measured by the slow march of the sun across the sky. A silent routine established itself between them, a pattern of provision woven into the fabric of their isolated lives. Every morning, when Elara opened her door, she would find a small offering on the porch step. A pail of still warm milk from the single cow he kept, a few freshly gathered eggs, a piece of smoked meat. He was a ghost, leaving these gifts in the pre-dawn gloom, never waiting to be seen or thanked. His presence was defined by his relentless work ethic. From sunrise to sunset, he was a blur of motion. She watched him from her small window as he mended fences, chopped wood, and worked with his horse, his energy seemingly inexhaustible. He was in a constant battle with the land, a fight not to conquer it, but simply to coexist. Her observation of him evolved. The initial fear, which had been tempered by his unexpected honor, slowly dissolved, replaced first by an analytical curiosity and then by a quiet, reluctant understanding. She saw things the brief encounter in town could never have revealed. She saw the gentleness with which he handled his animals, his rough hands surprisingly tender as he checked the horse's hooves or spoke in a low murmur to the cow. She saw his patience as he meticulously repaired a piece of tack, his focus absolute. And sometimes, in the evenings, she would see him stand by the graves marked by two simple wooden crosses on a low rise behind the main cabin. He would stand there for a long time, a solitary figure silhouetted against the fading light, lost in a private melancholy so profound it seemed to pull the warmth from the air. She began to understand that his silence was not born of anger or cruelty, but of a grief so deep it had hollowed him out, leaving only the shell of a man who knew how to work and how to endure. Within the four walls of her small cabin, Elara began to reclaim her own agency. The first few days had been a haze of exhaustion and uncertainty, but a spirit as resilient as hers could not remain dormant for long. She began with the space itself, an act of quiet rebellion against the chaos of her life. She scrubbed the floorboards until they were pale, washed the single window until it gleamed, and arranged the sparse furniture to create a sense of order and purpose. She mended the small tears in her spare dress with painstaking care, her needle a tiny weapon against the decay of her circumstances. These small acts were a declaration that she was more than just a survivor. She was a person who could create order from chaos, a small measure of beauty in a desolate world. She was carving out a life for herself within the narrow confines of her existence, proving to herself, if no one else, that she had not been broken. One afternoon, as she sat on her porch step, she found a small piece of cottonwood, soft and pale. With the small knife Caleb had left for her eating utensils, she began to carve. Her hands, surprisingly deft, found a forgotten rhythm. Hours passed. The wood slowly transformed, shedding its formless shape to become a small, delicate bird, its wings half spread as if about to take flight. It was a fragile, hopeful thing. The next morning, she did something that terrified her. When she retrieved the pail of milk he had left, she placed the small wooden bird in its place. It was a tiny offering, a bridge across the silent chasm that separated them. It was not payment, for his kindness could not be bought. It was a gesture of respect, a declaration of her personhood, a way of saying, I am here, and I am more than the sum of my misfortunes. I can create too. She watched from her window, her heart pounding, as he approached later. He stopped, saw the bird, and picked it up, turning it over and over in his large, calloused hands. He looked toward her cabin for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before he tucked the carving carefully into his shirt pocket and walked away. A week later, the first snows of winter dusted the high peaks, a stark white warning of the coming cold. The air grew sharp, and the days shortened. One evening, as dusk was settling its purple cloak over the valley, she heard his footsteps approach her door. It was the first time he had come to her cabin while she was awake. She stood, her hand flying to her throat, her heart a frantic drum. He did not knock. He simply stood on the porch, waiting for her to open the door. When she did, she saw he was holding a piece of paper. It was the contract, the document that had brought her here, its elegant script a mockery of her bondage. In his other hand he held a lit match. He looked her directly in the eye, his gaze intense, and held the paper to the flame. It caught quickly, curling into a black, brittle scroll before disintegrating into ash that the wind caught and scattered into the darkness. You are not owned, he said, his voice the same low rasp, but carrying a weight of finality that resonated deep in her soul. The firelight flickered in his pale eyes. The pass will be closed by the week's end. It is not safe to travel before the spring thaw. He paused, letting the words settle between them. You are free to leave then. You are free to stay. He had performed the ultimate symbolic act. He had not just offered her a lock. He had burned the cage itself. He was clarifying that her continued presence was her choice, not a matter of obligation or ownership. He was giving her back her life, a gift so immense she could not comprehend it. He turned and walked away without waiting for a response, leaving her standing in the doorway with the scent of smoke and the breathtaking, terrifying vista of freedom stretching out before her. The freedom he had given her was a beautiful, terrible thing. It was a promise of spring, but first, there was the winter to survive. The valley became a world of white and gray, the snow piling in deep drifts, isolating them completely from the outside world. The cold was a physical entity, a predator that gnawed at the edges of their small existence. The quiet rhythm of their lives continued, but it was charged with a new tension. The choice he had given her hung in the air between them. Every day she remained was a decision, a silent answer to his unspoken question. One night, the loneliness became too much to bear. It was a suffocating presence, a weight of all the loss she had endured, all the fear she had suppressed. She could not stay in the small cabin, its four walls pressing in on her. She pulled her thin shawl around her shoulders and slipped out into the biting cold, making her way to the relative shelter of the barn. She sought the darkest corner, sinking down into the clean, sweet-smelling hay. She thought she was alone, cocooned in the silent darkness of the barn, with only the soft sounds of the animals breathing in their stalls for company. And there, in the cold and the dark, she finally allowed herself to break. The tears came, hot and silent at first, then turning into quiet, racking sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for her family, lost to sickness in a crowded city. She cried for the home she could never return to. She whispered their names into the darkness, a litany of ghosts. She spoke of the lie that had brought her here, the false promise of a respectable position that had been a gilded cage for human trafficking. "I have nothing left," she whispered to the sleeping animals, her voice choked with grief. "I am no one." The despair was a black, icy river, and she was drowning in it. Up in the hayloft, mending a broken strap of tack by the light of a carefully shielded lantern, Caleb froze. He had heard the barn door creak and had extinguished his light, assuming it was a stray animal. But then he heard the soft sounds of weeping, and a voice, fragile and broken, whispering a story of unimaginable pain. He sat in the darkness, a silent, unwilling confessor, every word a blade twisting in his gut. He heard her speak of loss that mirrored his own, of a loneliness that was the twin of the one that stalked his own heart. He had seen her resilience, her quiet strength, and had assumed she was made of the same iron as he was. But hearing her now, stripped bare of her pride, her voice raw with a grief that he knew intimately, he understood. She was not iron. She was steel, forged in a fire he could barely imagine, but even steel could be broken. He did not move, did not make a sound. To reveal himself would be to shame her, to violate the sanctity of her private grief. He simply sat in the darkness and listened, and her words, her pain, etched themselves into the permanent record of his soul. He had thought of her as a responsibility, a problem to be solved. But in that moment she became something more. She became a person to be protected. The next morning the world was still and white. A heavy snow had fallen overnight, burying the valley even deeper. Elara awoke with a headache and swollen eyes, the shame of her breakdown a bitter taste in her mouth. She forced herself to go about her morning ritual, her movements stiff and slow. As she stepped outside, she saw them. 3 riders, dark shapes against the blinding white of the snow, picking their way down the trail into the valley. A cold dread, far sharper than the winter air, seized her. Caleb was already there, standing outside the main cabin, a rifle held loosely in his hand. He had seen them too. He turned and looked at her, his expression grim. "Get inside," he commanded, his voice flat and hard. "Bolt the door." There was no time for questions. She ran back into her cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs, and threw the heavy bolt home. Through her small window, she watched the riders approach. The man in the lead was stout, dressed in a fine city coat that looked absurdly out of place in the wilderness. Even from a distance, she could see the avarice in his face, the smug certainty of a man who believed the world and everyone in it belonged to him. It was Silas Stone, the agent who had arranged her passage, his smile as false as the promises he had made. The 2 men with him were of a different breed, hard-faced and carrying their rifles with a casual familiarity that spoke of violence as a trade. They reined in a short distance from Caleb. "I have come for my property, Thorn," Stone called out, his voice oily and loud in the pristine silence. "The girl." "A contract is a contract," Caleb did not answer. He simply stood his ground, a granite statue of defiance. "Do not be a fool," Stone sneered. "We will have her. One way or another." The threat hung in the frozen air. The crucible had arrived. The first shot was not a warning. It was a declaration of intent, a slug of hot lead that splintered the corner of the main cabin, inches from where Caleb stood. He didn't flinch. He melted back into the cover of the doorway, raising his own rifle. The valley, which had been so silent, erupted into a cacophony of gunfire. Elara was trapped, a spectator in her own flimsy fortress. She watched as Caleb returned fire, his movements calm and efficient. He was 1 man against 3, and the odds were not in his favor. A bullet punched through the thin wall of her cabin, showering her with splinters. The separation he had so honorably provided had now become a liability, a cage that left her exposed and helpless. Fear warred with a cold, rising anger. She would not be a prize to be fought over. She would not be property. A plan, desperate and reckless, formed in her mind. The back of her cabin was close to a thick stand of aspen, now bare and skeletal in the snow. If she could make it there, she could circle around to the barn and from there to the main house. She waited for a lull in the shooting, her breath held tight in her chest. Taking the poker from the fireplace, she worked it into the gap around the small rear window, prying at the wooden frame. It groaned, then splintered, giving way. She squeezed through the opening, her dress catching and tearing on a jagged edge, and dropped into the deep snow outside. She ran, her lungs burning with the icy air, her feet sinking into the powder, each step a monumental effort. The gunfire started again, and she flinched, but none of it was directed at her. They hadn't seen her. She reached the trees, then the barn, her body screaming with exertion. She slipped through the side door and crept toward the main house, staying low, using the water trough and a woodpile for cover. She reached the back door of the main cabin and hammered on it with her fist. "Caleb, it's me." The shooting stopped. She heard the bar on the inside being lifted, and the door swung open. He pulled her inside, his face a mask of grim fury and disbelief. "I told you to stay put," he growled. "They would have burned you out." She shot back, breathless. "I am not a liability." His eyes locked on hers, and in them he saw not fear, but a cold, hard resolve that matched his own. The argument died before it could begin. There was no time. He barred the door again and moved back to the front window. "Stay down," he ordered. She ignored him. On the wall, mounted on wooden pegs, was an old but well-maintained rifle, a long-barreled Spencer. Without a word, she took it down. He turned to object, but stopped when he saw how she held it. She didn't cradle it awkwardly. She held it with a familiarity that was utterly shocking. She worked the action, checked the chamber, and brought the stock to her shoulder in a single, fluid motion. It was a movement she had practiced 1,000 times with her father, a gamekeeper on an old country estate. "The one on the left," she said, her voice steady and low. He reloaded slow. Caleb stared at her for a heartbeat, his mind struggling to reconcile the vulnerable woman who had wept in his barn with the cold-eyed shooter standing before him. Then he gave a curt nod. It was a moment of profound, unspoken trust. They were no longer protector and protected. They were partners. They fought together, a silent, deadly team. They communicated not with words, but with glances, with gestures, with an instinctive understanding of each other's movements. She was more than competent. She was a natural marksman, her shots precise and devastating. She anticipated their opponent's moves, calling out targets, her strategic mind a sharp counterpoint to his raw, defensive power. The balance of the fight shifted. They were no longer one man against three. They were a unified force, a fortress of two. The fight raged for what felt like an eternity, the cabin filling with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the deafening roar of the rifles. One of Stone's men went down, a cry cut short in the snow. The other, seeing his partner fall, lost his nerve and fled, scrambling for his horse and galloping back the way he had come. That left only Stone. He was a coward, not a fighter, and he hunkered down behind a snow-covered boulder, firing blindly. As night began to fall, a deep, frozen twilight that swallowed the light, the silence returned, broken only by the whistling of the wind. The siege was not over, but there was a lull, a temporary truce imposed by the darkness and the cold. They sat in the near darkness of the cabin, the embers in the hearth providing the only light. The adrenaline of the battle had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and the tremor in Elara's hands that she could not control. Caleb saw it. He moved to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee, his movements slow and deliberate. He handed one to her, his fingers brushing hers. This time, the contact was not a jolt, but a quiet anchor in the stormy aftermath of the violence. They sat in silence for a long time, the shared danger having stripped away all pretense, all barriers. "My wife," he said suddenly, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "Sarah, and my daughter, Lily." There buried on that hill, he didn't look at her, but stared into the dying fire, his eyes seeing a past she could only imagine. A fever took them. One winter much like this one. I was away trapping. By the time I got back, it was too late. He finally turned to look at her. His pale eyes filled with a pain so raw it was like an open wound. The silence they left. It was a living thing. It ate everything. Until you came, he was connecting his loss to the loss she had whispered about in the barn, acknowledging her pain by sharing his own. It was a vulnerable revelation, a confession from a man who had forgotten how to speak of his own heart. In the shared space of their grief, the last wall between them crumbled into dust. The crisis ended not with a bang, but with the whimper of a coward. In the dead of night, under the cold light of the moon, Silas Stone slipped away, leaving the body of his hired man to the wolves and the winter. The morning dawned on a world transformed. A fresh layer of snow had fallen, burying the footprints, the bloodstains, the evidence of the fight, muffling the valley in a blanket of profound, hushed silence. The immediate danger was gone, but something had fundamentally changed. The violence had been a fire that had burned away the last of their isolation, forging a bond between them that was stronger than steel. The emotional wall that had separated them was not just breached. It had been utterly demolished. Elara never moved back to the line cabin. There was no discussion, no formal invitation. It was simply understood. She had fought for this house, bled for it in spirit if not in body. It was her home now as much as it was his. Her few belongings found their way from the small cabin to the main house, integrating themselves into the space as she herself was integrating into his life. The small carved bird appeared on the mantelpiece above the hearth. Her spare dress hung next to his worn jacket by the door. Their two separate, solitary lives had merged into one household, a quiet partnership born of shared hardship and mutual respect. The end of their separation was as silent and as natural as the turning of a season. A new language developed between them, one spoken not with words, but with shared tasks and comfortable silences. He taught her the skills she would need to survive in this world. He showed her how to read the weather in the clouds, how to set a snare line, how to clean and load the Spencer rifle until the movements were second nature to her. In turn, she brought a different kind of life to his home. She mended his clothes, organized the chaotic clutter of his bachelor existence, and cooked meals that were more than just fuel for the body. The aroma of baking bread filled the cabin, a scent of warmth and life that pushed back against the lingering ghosts of his grief. These small acts of care, of provision, of teaching and learning became their new dialogue. They were rebuilding a life not just for themselves as individuals, but for them as a unit. The winter was long and hard, but for the first time in years, neither of them was truly alone. They were a team, facing the relentless cold, the scarcity, and the profound isolation together. They found a rhythm, a balance. He was the strength, the shield against the harshness of the world outside. She was the warmth, the heart that made the cabin a sanctuary against the cold. The silence that had once been a chasm of awkwardness and fear was now a shared space of peace and understanding. They could sit for hours by the fire, he cleaning his rifle, she mending a shirt, without needing to speak a single word, yet communicating more than most people do in a lifetime of conversation. One evening, as the first signs of the spring thaw began to appear, the drip of melting snow from the eaves a gentle percussion against the silence, they sat by the fire. Caleb was staring at the small wooden bird she had carved, which she had placed on the mantel. He reached up and took it down, his large thumb stroking the smooth wood. He looked from the bird to her, a faint, almost imperceptible softness in his pale eyes. "This house," he began, his voice low and rough, yet clearer than she had ever heard it. "For 5 years it was just a place to sleep, a shelter from the storm. For walls to keep the silence in." He paused, turning his gaze back to the fire, as if the words were difficult to pull from the depths of his soul. "Now," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "it is a home." It was the simplest of declarations, yet it held the weight of 1,000 unsentimental poems. It was his confession, the emotional climax of their slow, hard-won journey. It was an admission that she had not just filled the silence. She had ended it. She had brought life back to a place, and a man, that had long been left for dead. In the quiet warmth of the firelight, Elara knew that she had finally found her place, not in a new land, but in the heart of a man who had listened to her tears in the darkness and had, in turn, shown her the way back to the light.